When Daniel Reeves signed the foreclosure papers on the old Hartman meat packing plant for $310, the county clerk stared at him like he'd just purchased a tomb. The building hadn't processed livestock in 19 years, its equipment frozen into monuments of industrial death, its drains clogged with decades of congealed refuse no one wanted to think about. But Daniel wasn't buying potential. He was buying a roof for himself and his 9-year-old son, Lucas, because their apartment lease had been terminated and his welding job at the pipeline had ended when the project got canceled. Sometimes rock bottom looks like opportunity if you're desperate enough to squint. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel stood in the cracked asphalt lot of the meatpacking plant on a blistering August afternoon in West Texas, his truck's engine ticking as it cooled under the merciless sun. Lucas pressed against his side despite the heat, both of them staring at the structure that would become their home. The building sprawled before them like a cathedral of forgotten commerce. 2 stories of weathered concrete and rusted metal siding, surrounded by empty cattle pens that stretched across 5 acres of sun-bleached dirt. A faded sign still hung above the main entrance, letters barely visible through layers of dust and bird droppings. Hartman Quality Meats, EST 1897. The name meant nothing to Daniel. Just another piece of discarded history in a county full of them. Lucas's small hand tightened around his. "It smells bad, Dad." Daniel couldn't argue. Even from outside, the building carried the ghost of its former purpose. Not fresh blood, but something older and more pervasive. The scent of death that had soaked into concrete and refused to leave even after 2 decades of abandonment. That made it perfect. No one else would want it, which meant no one would compete for it, which meant Daniel could actually afford it. The math was simple enough. $310 for the building versus $950 a month for the apartment they could no longer keep. The slaughterhouse had walls and a mostly intact roof. That made it a palace compared to the alternative, which was sleeping in his truck at rest stops while trying to hide Lucas from Child Protective Services. "Old doesn't mean bad," Daniel said, injecting confidence into his voice that he didn't remotely feel. "It just means sturdy. They built these places to last. We can make it work." Lucas looked up at him with eyes that carried too much understanding for 9 years old. He'd developed that look over the past 18 months since his mother, Jennifer, had died in the car accident. Sudden, violent, final. No time for goodbyes or explanations. Just Daniel holding Lucas at the funeral while trying to figure out how to be both parents at once. The county clerk had given Daniel a single key, heavy iron worn smooth by countless hands over more than a century. It felt like an anchor in his palm as he approached the main entrance. A massive steel door designed to keep the cold in and everything else out. The key slid into the lock with surprising ease, and the door swung open with a metallic groan that echoed through the space beyond. The interior hit them like a physical force. Heat that had built up over 19 summers with no ventilation. Dust thick enough to taste. And beneath it all, that persistent smell of old death and industrial chemicals, cleaners that had tried and failed to erase the building's fundamental purpose. What sunlight filtered through grimy windows revealed a vast open space filled with silent equipment. Massive conveyor systems, stainless steel tables, hooks hanging from ceiling-mounted rails like a forest of metal teeth. The processing floor occupied most of the ground level, ceiling lost in shadows 20 feet above. Metal stairs led to a second floor where offices had once operated, their doors hanging open to reveal rooms filled with abandoned filing cabinets and desks buried under years of accumulated grime. "Can we really live here?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice small in that enormous space. Daniel surveyed their new home with what he hoped resembled optimism. "We'll make it work. See those offices upstairs? We'll pick the best one, clean it out real good, set up our beds. I can get the electricity working, rig up some cooling. Maybe even get water running. It'll be an adventure." "I don't want adventures anymore," Lucas said softly. The words struck Daniel harder than the boy probably intended. Lucas used to love adventures. Before Jennifer died, before Daniel's steady pipeline work dried up, before their life became a series of increasingly desperate compromises. Lucas had been fearless. He'd explored construction sites with Daniel, built elaborate forts from scrap materials, invented games that could occupy him for hours. Now he flinched at change, clung to routine, looked at the world through eyes that expected disappointment. Daniel knelt to his son's level, his knees protesting against the dirty concrete. "I know things have been hard. I know you didn't ask for any of this. But I promise we're going to be okay. This place might not look like much now, but it's ours. Nobody can evict us. Nobody can raise the rent. We just need to make it livable." Lucas studied his face with that too perceptive gaze. "You promise?" Daniel had learned the weight that promises to children carried. "Promises you might not be able to keep." "I promise we'll try our hardest. That's all I've got." Lucas seemed to accept it, nodding slightly before turning his attention back to exploring their strange new home. They spent the remaining daylight hours doing basic reconnaissance. Daniel tested light switches, finding to his relief that some electricity still functioned, though several circuits had clearly failed. The plumbing proved more complicated. Water flowed when he turned a rusted faucet in what had been the facility's bathroom, but it ran brown for several long minutes before clearing. The toilets functioned, which Daniel counted as a significant victory given his low expectations. The upper floor revealed administrative offices, a break room with a refrigerator that had become a biological experiment, and storage areas packed with boxes of old paperwork and supplies. Daniel made mental notes of what could be salvaged. Some cleaning supplies, basic tools, even a few folding chairs that might work once wiped down. As the sun began its descent toward the flat Texas horizon, Daniel started hauling their possessions from the truck. They didn't have much. 2 duffel bags of clothes, a box of Lucas's toys and books, Daniel's tool bag, sleeping bags and blankets, a portable camping stove, and a cooler with what food they'd managed to save. 3 trips to get everything inside, each one emphasizing just how little they'd accumulated in 9 years of Lucas's life. He chose the largest office on the 2nd floor for their living space. It had windows facing west that would catch the sunset, and a door that still closed properly. Daniel swept out the worst of the dust and debris, then laid out their sleeping bags on the floor. The camping stove went in one corner, their food supplies in another. Lucas arranged his toys on the window ledge with careful precision, creating order in the chaos. "It's like camping," Daniel offered, watching his son sort through his action figures. "Camping is supposed to be temporary," Lucas replied without looking up. Daniel had no response to that. Instead, he focused on practical tasks. Cooling would be their immediate challenge. The slaughterhouse had been designed to maintain cold temperatures for meat preservation, but those massive refrigeration systems hadn't functioned in years. For tonight, he'd brought a small portable fan that would at least move the hot air around. Tomorrow he'd investigate whether any of the building's cooling infrastructure could be salvaged. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They ate dinner sitting on the floor of their new room. Sandwiches made from supplies Daniel had picked up at a gas station on their way into town. Lucas chewed slowly, his eyes wandering around the bare office walls. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, turning the windows into black mirrors that reflected the single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "Tell me about Mom," Lucas said suddenly. The request caught Daniel off guard. Lucas rarely asked about Jennifer anymore. The first few months after the accident, Lucas had asked constantly. Where was Mom? Was she in heaven? Did she know they missed her? Daniel had fumbled through explanations that satisfied neither of them, eventually settling on variations of "Mom loved you very much" and "some things we can't understand." After a while, Lucas stopped asking. Daniel had thought that meant acceptance. Now he wondered if it had just been retreat. "What do you want to know?" Daniel asked carefully. Lucas picked at his sandwich. "Do you think she would be mad about us living here?" Daniel wrestled with this question. Would Jennifer be angry that their son was sleeping on the floor of an abandoned slaughterhouse? Or would she understand that Daniel was doing everything he could with impossible circumstances? He'd never know. Jennifer was gone, and he was left making decisions alone, hoping he wasn't failing their son in ways that would mark him forever. Your mom understood that life doesn't always go the way we plan, Daniel said honestly. She grew up without much herself. Her family struggled. She knew what it meant to make hard choices. I think she'd understand we're doing what we have to do to stay together. Lucas absorbed this quietly. I just want to feel safe again. The simple statement nearly broke Daniel. Good. That's what I want too, buddy. They finished dinner in comfortable silence. Daniel cleaned up their minimal dishes while Lucas prepared for bed, changing into his pajamas and brushing his teeth in the stark bathroom down the hall. When he returned, Daniel tucked him into his sleeping bag and read to him from one of the books they'd brought, a battered copy of Holes that had been Lucas's favorite before everything changed. Lucas fell asleep halfway through the chapter, his breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood rest. Daniel continued reading softly for a few more minutes, reluctant to stop this small piece of normalcy. Finally, he closed the book and simply sat there, watching his son sleep in their strange new home. The slaughterhouse made sounds at night. Metal contracting as temperatures dropped. Wind finding its way through gaps in the structure. Something dripping somewhere deep in the building's plumbing. Normal sounds for an old industrial building, Daniel told himself, even as they raised the hairs on his neck. He'd grown up in suburbs and rental houses, not sprawling meatpacking plants. The sheer size of the place, the echoing spaces below, the shadows that pressed against their small island of light, it all felt overwhelming in the darkness. Daniel checked the fan to make sure it was positioned safely, then settled into his own sleeping bag. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the hard floor beneath him. At some point in the early morning hours, exhaustion finally won. He woke to brutal Texas sunlight streaming through the dirty windows and Lucas already awake, sitting cross-legged on his sleeping bag and drawing in his sketchbook. Daniel had bought him that sketchbook and a set of colored pencils 4 months ago, back when he'd still had steady work. Lucas had filled half of it already with elaborate drawings of machines and buildings, detailed technical sketches that showed surprising talent for a 9-year-old. "Morning, kiddo," Daniel said, his voice rough from sleep in the dry air. "Morning," Lucas replied without looking up from his drawing. "The building makes weird sounds at night. Old places do that. It's just the metal settling, temperature changes. Nothing to worry about." Lucas nodded but didn't look convinced. Daniel couldn't blame him. In daylight, the slaughterhouse looked less menacing but no more welcoming. Just old, vast, and fundamentally empty. Daniel made them a basic breakfast on the camping stove. Instant oatmeal and coffee for himself. As they ate, he outlined his plan for the day. First priority was getting water heaters and cooling systems evaluated. If anything could be salvaged, they'd have better living conditions. If not, he'd need to figure out alternative solutions before the real summer heat intensified. "Can I explore while you work?" Lucas asked. Daniel hesitated. The slaughterhouse was large, potentially dangerous with its old machinery and questionable structural integrity. But keeping Lucas confined to one office seemed cruel, and he couldn't watch him constantly while trying to assess the building systems. "You can explore the second floor," Daniel compromised. "But you stay away from the processing equipment downstairs, and you stay where I can hear you if you call. Deal?" "Deal," Lucas agreed readily. They spent the morning on parallel tasks. Daniel descended to the mechanical rooms, dark spaces beneath the main processing floor accessed by narrow staircases that creaked alarmingly under his weight. The refrigeration system was a beast from another era, massive compressors and cooling units covered in rust and leaked refrigerant. Daniel knew basic mechanical systems from his welding work, but this antique equipment was beyond his expertise. He'd need to call on a specialist, which meant money he didn't have. Meanwhile, Lucas's footsteps echoed overhead as he wandered the second-floor offices. Occasionally, he'd call down to Daniel, reporting his discoveries. An office with inspection certificates still on the walls. A storage room full of old rubber boots. A break room with a calendar frozen on June 1998. Daniel was making notes on the cooling system, trying to determine what might be salvageable, when Lucas's voice cut through the building with unusual urgency. "Dad! Dad, come quick!" Daniel was up those stairs faster than he thought possible, heart hammering. Lucas's tone hadn't been panic exactly, but something close. He found his son standing at the far end of the second-floor hallway, in front of what appeared to be a solid concrete wall. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, scanning for danger. "Nothing's wrong," Lucas said, his eyes bright with excitement. "But look at this." He pressed his hand against what appeared to be solid wall, and a section of the concrete facing swung inward with a soft mechanical click, revealing a heavy steel door beneath. A door Daniel would have sworn wasn't there moments before. "It's a hidden door," Lucas whispered. "I was leaning against the wall and felt something move under the concrete facing. There's a button." Daniel approached cautiously, examining the mechanism. The false concrete panel was cleverly designed to seem like solid wall when closed, operated by a hidden switch disguised as an electrical junction box. Beyond the steel door, darkness suggested a space larger than a simple utility closet. "Stay here," Daniel instructed Lucas. He pulled out his phone, activating its flashlight function, and pulled the steel door open fully. Cold air rushed out, impossibly cold given the building's overall temperature. The room beyond was roughly 15 feet square, and as Daniel's phone light swept across the space, he understood why it was so cold. He was looking at a massive freezer vault, still functioning after 19 years of building abandonment. Industrial-grade insulation lined the walls. Frost covered every surface. And stacked along one wall were metal containers, cases of some kind, crystallized with ice but clearly intact. But what commanded Daniel's attention was the opposite wall, where a large photograph hung in a protective frame, somehow preserved despite the extreme cold. The image showed a man in his 60s, dressed in the formal style of the early 20th century. He stood in what appeared to be this very building, one hand resting on a large meat cleaver, his expression stern and uncompromising. Beneath the photograph, a brass plate bore an inscription Daniel had to step closer to read through the frost. Augustus Hartman, 1862–1939. Founder, Hartman Quality Meats. "What is it?" Lucas called from the doorway, unable to contain his curiosity. "It's a hidden freezer," Daniel said slowly. "I think it belonged to the man who built this place." Lucas slipped past him despite his earlier instruction to stay put, his eyes huge as he took in the frozen vault. Why would someone hide a freezer? It was an excellent question. Daniel had no answer. He moved to the metal containers, examining them more closely. They weren't food storage. The cases were too heavy, too deliberately sealed. He pried open the nearest one, ice crystals shattering as he broke the seal. Inside, wrapped in oil-treated canvas that had survived decades in frozen preservation, were neat stacks of gold bars. Small ones, maybe half a pound each, but unmistakably gold. Daniel counted quickly. 20 bars in this case alone. And there were at least a dozen more cases stacked against the wall. His hands trembled as he opened another case. More gold. A third case. More still. "Daddy," Lucas whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Is that real gold?" Daniel stared at the precious metal gleaming dully in his phone's light. "Real gold. Probably hundreds of thousands of dollars worth, maybe more. Hidden in a frozen vault in an abandoned slaughterhouse he'd purchased for $310. "Yes," Daniel heard himself say from very far away. "I think it is." Daniel spent the next 4 hours locked in that frozen vault while Lucas sat outside, entertaining himself with his sketchbook. The cold bit through Daniel's jacket, numbed his fingers, made his breath fog in the air, but he couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until he understood what Augustus Hartman had left behind. The vault contained more than gold. Tucked behind the metal cases, Daniel found a leather journal, its pages stiff with cold but remarkably preserved by the freezing temperatures. He carried it out to warmer air, waiting for it to thaw enough to open without damaging the brittle paper. While he waited, Daniel counted 12 cases total, each containing 20 gold bars. At current prices, even accounting for the need to sell discreetly, he was looking at somewhere north of $300,000. Maybe closer to $400,000 if the gold was pure and he found the right buyer. It was more money than Daniel had earned in the last 5 years combined. Enough to give Lucas everything Jennifer's death had stolen from him. A real home, good schools, college fully funded, security against every disaster that might come. Everything a father could want for his son. But the journal, when it finally thought enough to read, complicated everything. The first page contained a single line written in precise, old-fashioned script: "For whoever finds this, having purchased what my blood abandoned, you've earned the right to know what they never deserved to know." Daniel's hands trembled as he turned to the next page, where detailed entries began. Not business records, but something more personal. A confession of sorts, written by a man who clearly trusted no one. Augustus Hartman's entries spanned from 1925 to 1939, documenting not just where he'd hidden wealth, but why. The man had lived through the financial panic of 1907 and the stock market crash of 1929. He'd watched neighbors lose everything to banks they'd trusted. So he'd created his own security, systematically converting portions of his profits into gold and hiding it where his children couldn't squander it. The journal described not one vault, but 4 separate locations across the property. Gold divided and hidden with the careful paranoia of a man who'd seen empires crumble overnight. But it was the final entry, dated 2 weeks before Augustus's death in 1939, that made Daniel's chest tighten. "My sons believe this business is their birthright, earned through blood rather than character. Neither understands what built this operation. Neither respects the animals who died here or the men who labored to process them. They see only profit, not purpose. I have made arrangements. Let the land judge who is worthy. Let time separate the patient from the entitled. Whoever purchases what my sons will surely abandon, may they prove worthier than my blood." Daniel read those words 3 times, trying to parse the bitterness. A father disinheriting his sons not through legal channels, but through concealment. Augustus had left the slaughterhouse to his children in his will, but the wealth that actually mattered, he'd hidden with instructions only discoverable by someone who occupied the property long enough to stumble upon its secrets. The sons had clearly sold everything eventually. The paperwork Daniel had found suggested the plant had operated sporadically through the 1950s and 60s before closing permanently in 1998. 60 years of the Hartman family slowly liquidating their inheritance without ever finding what really mattered. And now that inheritance belonged to Daniel Reeves, a 34-year-old welder who'd bought the property because he'd run out of options, not because he deserved anything. Daniel emerged from his research to find Lucas had drawn an elaborate picture of the hidden door, complete with frost crystals and mysterious shadows. The boy looked up as his father appeared, his expression curious but patient. "Did you find treasure?" Lucas asked. "Maybe," Daniel said. "I found some very old information. I need to check a few things to know if it means anything. Can I help?" Daniel considered this. He'd need to locate the other 3 vaults Augustus had mentioned. Some of that work Lucas could participate in safely. And honestly, the idea of having company while he pursued what might be an elaborate dead man's joke appealed to him. "Yeah," Daniel said. "You can help." They drove into Brownfield, the nearest town of any size, with the journal locked in Daniel's glove compartment. The town consisted of one main street lined with businesses that had seen better days. A hardware store, a diner, a feed supply shop, a bar called the Cattleman's Rest that probably served as the town's heart. Daniel parked outside the hardware store, a place called Morrison's that looked like it had been there since Augustus Hartman's time. The interior smelled of fertilizer, metal, and motor oil. An older man stood behind the counter, his weathered face and scarred hands marking him as someone who'd done more than just sell supplies over his lifetime. "Help you find something?" the man asked. Daniel had prepared a mental list. Shovels, a heavy-duty flashlight, work gloves, and bolt cutters in case any of the other vaults had rusted locks. Need some excavation supplies. Couple shovels, good flashlight, and heavy bolt cutters. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. You the fellow who bought the old Hartman place? News traveled fast in small towns. Daniel shouldn't have been surprised. That's me. Daniel Reeves. Carl Morrison, the man said, extending a calloused hand. My grandfather worked at that slaughterhouse back in the 20s and 30s. Said it was brutal work but honest pay. Augustus Hartman ran a tight operation. Paid fairly, treated his men with respect even if he worked them hard. Daniel felt a strange connection to the stern face in that frozen photograph. What happened to the operation? Why'd it close? Carl's expression soured. Augustus's sons, that's what happened. Robert and William Hartman. Both inherited ambition without skill, entitlement without vision. They spent 40 years running that plant into the ground. Refused to modernize, treated workers like disposable parts, cut corners on quality until they lost all the premium contracts. By the time William's son took over in the 80s, there wasn't much left to salvage. Place limped along part-time until the late 90s, then just died. The story aligned with what Daniel had read in Augustus's journal. A legacy destroyed by entitled heirs who'd never understood what built it. Well, Daniel said, I'm hoping to make something of the property. Maybe convert it to workshops or storage. Starting with cleanup. Carl studied him with an assessing gaze. What exactly are you planning to excavate? Daniel had anticipated this question. Previous owners left a lot of junk on the property. Old equipment, scrap metal buried in various places. Figured I'd dig it up, sell what I can for scrap, clean the place up properly. Carl nodded slowly, accepting this explanation. Bolt cutters are on that wall. Got professional grade ones, run you about 120. Shovels and flashlights over here. The total came to $287, leaving Daniel with almost nothing. As Carl rang up the purchase, he said casually, you know, there's been stories about that slaughterhouse for years. Folks say old Augustus hid money all over the property before he died. Urban legend type stuff, but the stories persist. Daniel kept his expression neutral. People say that about a lot of old places. Usually, Carl agreed. But Augustus Hartman wasn't like most people. Man survived 2 financial collapses by being smarter and more careful than everyone around him. Wouldn't surprise me if the stories had some truth. Daniel loaded his purchases into his truck, hyper-aware of the journal in his glove compartment. If rumors about hidden wealth already existed, he'd need to be extremely careful. The last thing he needed was treasure hunters or opportunistic locals taking interest in his activities. Back at the slaughterhouse, Daniel spread Augustus's hand-drawn maps across a workbench in one of the offices, comparing them to the current property layout. The second vault was supposedly located beneath what the journal called the western holding pen. Daniel had noticed a large concrete pad at the property's western edge, probably the foundation of some demolished structure. The map indicated the vault was buried 8 feet due south of the pad's southwest corner at a depth of 6 feet. If the measurements were accurate, and if the vault hadn't been disturbed, Daniel was looking at major excavation work. He and Lucas walked the property as the afternoon heat pressed down like a weight. The western pad sat in an area now overgrown with mesquite and prickly pear cactus. Daniel marked the spot the measurements indicated, then started digging. The Texas soil was hard, baked by decades of sun and drought. Daniel worked steadily, sweat soaking through his shirt, blisters forming despite the gloves. Lucas helped by clearing away the dirt he excavated, piling it neatly to one side. 3 hours of digging brought them to a depth of 5 feet. Daniel's back screamed, his shoulders ached, and doubt had begun creeping in. Maybe Augustus's map was deliberately misleading. Maybe the vault had been discovered years ago. Maybe this whole thing was an elaborate fantasy of a paranoid old man. Then a shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty property. Daniel dropped to his knees in the hole, using his gloved hands to brush away soil from what his shovel had hit. Metal emerged, pitted with rust but intact. Another vault door, smaller than the frozen one but similar in construction. Heavy steel, industrial-grade lock. "Is that another treasure room?" Lucas called from above, leaning over the edge of the hole. Daniel applied the bolt cutters to the rusted lock. It resisted, then gave way with a sharp crack. He pulled the vault door open. Inside, wrapped in the same oil-treated canvas, were more gold bars. Not as many as the frozen vault, maybe 50 total. But also something else, stacks of old currency, carefully preserved, and what appeared to be stock certificates from companies Daniel had never heard of. At current gold prices, even discounting the questionable value of 80-year-old stocks and currency, he was looking at another $150,000 minimum. Lucas stared at the contents with huge eyes. "Daddy, we're rich." Rich. The word felt foreign, impossible. 48 hours ago, Daniel had been counting change to buy gas. Now he was looking at potentially $500,000 in hidden wealth, with 2 more vaults still to locate. "We need to be very careful," Daniel said, his voice sounding strange. "We can't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Not until I figure out what we're supposed to do." That evening, after Lucas was asleep, Daniel researched inheritance law and property rights on his phone. The legal situation seemed clear enough. He'd purchased the property through legitimate foreclosure. Assets found on the property belonged to him. Augustus Hartman's heirs had owned the land for decades and sold it off without discovering what lay beneath. Their loss, legally speaking. But Daniel kept coming back to Augustus's final entry. The bitterness of a father disappointed in his sons. The deliberate construction of a system that would only reward someone who actually occupied and worked the property. His phone rang, startling him in the quiet office. Unknown number, local area code. Daniel answered cautiously. "Daniel Reeves," a woman's voice, professional and clipped. "My name is Catherine Hartman. I understand you recently purchased the Hartman meat packing property." Daniel's stomach dropped. Hartman. A descendant. Calling him the same day he'd found the second vault. "That's right," Daniel said carefully. "Can I help you with something?" "I'd like to meet with you," Catherine said. "Discuss the property, its history. I'm Augustus Hartman's great-granddaughter. My family has some interest in the site's historical preservation." Historical preservation. Code for searching for Augustus's rumored hidden wealth, most likely. Carl Morrison's casual mention of the legends suddenly seemed less innocent. "I'm not looking to sell," Daniel said. "I'm not looking to buy," Catherine countered smoothly. "Just to talk. I'm in town tomorrow. Perhaps we could meet at the property. Say 10 o'clock in the morning?" Daniel wanted to refuse, but curiosity won. He wanted to see what Augustus's great-granddaughter knew, what she wanted. And maybe, despite everything, he wanted to look her in the eye and decide for himself whether she deserved to know about the wealth her ancestor had deliberately hidden from her family. 10 o'clock works, Daniel agreed. After the call ended, Daniel sat in the dark office, listening to Lucas's peaceful breathing and the old building's nighttime sounds. Tomorrow would bring complications he wasn't prepared for. A confrontation between blood inheritance and discovered fortune, between what was legal and what might be right. He thought about Augustus's photograph hanging in that frozen vault, that stern, uncompromising expression. What would the old man say if he could see his great-granddaughter coming to claim what he'd specifically denied her lineage? Catherine Hartman arrived exactly at 10 o'clock, driving a white SUV that looked aggressively out of place against the slaughterhouse's industrial decay. She emerged dressed in what Daniel recognized as expensive casual wear, the kind of clothing designed to look effortless while probably costing more than his monthly grocery budget. Early 40s, he guessed, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Lucas watched from the second-floor window as Daniel descended to meet their visitor. He'd told his son to stay inside during the conversation, a precaution that felt increasingly necessary as Catherine approached with measured stride. Mr. Reeves, she said, extending a hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet. Her handshake was firm, professional. Daniel noted she wore a simple wedding band and her eyes were already scanning the slaughterhouse's exterior with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. Ms. Hartman, Daniel replied. You said you wanted to discuss the property's history. Catherine, please. She turned her full attention to him, and Daniel recognized the expression. Assessment. She was trying to determine what kind of person she was dealing with, how much he might know, what leverage she might have. My great-grandfather built this place. It's been connected to my family for over a century, even if we no longer own it. Your family sold it, Daniel pointed out. Multiple times from what I understand. It went through at least 4 different owners before the county foreclosed. Catherine's jaw tightened slightly. My uncle and father made decisions I didn't agree with. They saw the slaughterhouse as a burden, a failing business. They never understood what Augustus built here. Daniel gestured toward the building. And what did Augustus build here exactly? Catherine turned to study the slaughterhouse, her expression shifting to something that might have been genuine nostalgia. An empire, for a time. Augustus Hartman came to Texas with nothing in 1890. By 1920, he controlled meat processing contracts across 5 counties. He employed over 150 men at the operation's peak, paid them fairly, treated them with dignity in an industry known for exploiting workers. My great-grandfather believed in building something that would last, a legacy for his family. But it didn't last, Daniel said. No. Catherine's voice carried bitter acknowledgement. My grandfather Robert inherited ambition without skill. My great-uncle William had arrogance without vision. They spent 40 years dismantling what Augustus built. My own father finished the job. She turned back to Daniel. Which brings me to why I'm here. There are family stories about Augustus. Things he may have left behind that weren't part of the official estate. There it was. Daniel kept his expression neutral. What kind of things? Catherine studied him carefully before responding. Augustus didn't trust banks. The panics and crashes reinforced that distrust. Family legend suggests he may have kept assets hidden on the property, insurance against economic collapse. My father dismissed these stories as fantasy, but I've done research. I've found references in old journals, cryptic mentions in letters. I believe the stories are true. And you want to search my property for your great-grandfather's hidden treasure? Daniel said flatly. I want to recover assets that rightfully belong to Augustus's bloodline, Catherine corrected. You purchased the building and land, Mr. Reeves. No one disputes that. But if there are family assets hidden here, those weren't part of the sale. They remain family property. That's not how property law works, Daniel said. I bought the land and everything on it. Anything found on the property belongs to me. Legally, perhaps, Catherine conceded. But morally, these are my family's assets, hidden by my great-grandfather for his descendants. The fact that my grandfather and father were too incompetent to find them doesn't change the fundamental ownership. And the fact that Augustus apparently hid them specifically so his sons wouldn't find them? Daniel asked quietly. Does that change the fundamental ownership? Catherine's eyes widened. What do you know about that? Daniel realized his mistake too late. He'd revealed knowledge that shouldn't be accessible to someone who'd only owned the property for 3 days. But backing down now would only make things worse. I found Augustus's hidden vault, Daniel said. And I found his journal. I know exactly what he thought of his sons and why he hid what he hid. For a long moment, Catherine simply stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed without much humor. So you actually found it. The vault everyone whispered about but no one could locate. How? My son has a talent for finding things, Daniel said. Catherine's expression shifted, calculation replacing surprise. Then you know where everything is located. You know what's buried here. I know what might be here, Daniel corrected. It was a lie, but necessary. Catherine didn't need to know about the gold bars currently secured in the frozen vault. Mr. Reeves. Daniel. Her tone became more conciliatory. I understand this puts you in a difficult position. You purchased this property legally. But I'm asking you to consider the ethical dimensions. Augustus was my family. His wealth was built through generations of work. Does the fact that you happen to buy this building give you moral right to everything he accumulated? Does the fact that you share his blood give you moral right to wealth he specifically hid from his descendants? Daniel countered. Catherine flinched. You read what he wrote about my grandfather? I did. Robert was a difficult man, Catherine said quietly. Entitled, cruel sometimes, dismissive of others. Everything Augustus wrote was probably true. But that doesn't define our entire family. I barely knew Robert. He died when I was 8. I'm not asking for this inheritance because I deserve it through some divine right of blood. I'm asking because I've spent my adult life trying to understand Augustus, trying to honor what he built in ways my grandfather and father never did. What does that mean? Daniel asked. Catherine pulled out her phone, scrolling through images before handing it to Daniel. The photos showed historical documents, research materials, academic papers. I'm a historian, Mr. Reeves. I specialize in agricultural and industrial development in the American Southwest. I've written extensively about the meat-packing industry's evolution. Augustus's story is part of that history, and I've been documenting it for 20 years. Daniel scrolled through the images. Articles bearing Catherine's name, photographs of Augustus at various stages of his life, copies of operational records from the slaughterhouse. The research was extensive, genuine. So you want the money to fund more research? Daniel asked. I want the money because I'm 42 years old, teaching at a community college for poverty wages, and living in a rental house I can barely afford, Catherine said bluntly. I want it because I'm Augustus's great-granddaughter and I'm struggling while his wealth sits hidden on properties sold off by people who never appreciated what they had. I want it because, yes, it would change my life. And unlike my grandfather and father, I would actually do something meaningful with it. The raw honesty surprised Daniel. He'd expected legal threats or emotional manipulation, not this direct acknowledgement of personal desperation. It was something he could relate to intimately. Two people standing on opposite sides of an inheritance neither had expected, both struggling with circumstances beyond their control. I need time to think about this, Daniel said finally. Catherine nodded slowly. How much time? I don't know. A few days at least. And in the meantime, you'll what? Excavate what you can and then decide how much to share. Daniel met her gaze steadily. In the meantime, I'll read more of Augustus's journal, understand what he wanted, and try to figure out the right thing to do. Which is more consideration than your family gave this place for 60 years. Catherine absorbed this quietly. That's fair, she said eventually. More than fair, actually. She pulled a business card from her purse, handing it to Daniel. That's my number. When you're ready to talk, call me. And Daniel, thank you for not just telling me to leave. After Catherine departed, Daniel stood in the slaughterhouse parking lot, turning her business card over in his hands. Dr. Catherine Hartman, Professor of History. A scholar struggling to survive in academia's brutal economy, researching the legacy her own family had abandoned. Lucas emerged from the building, having apparently watched the entire conversation from his window perch. Was that lady mad? Not mad, Daniel said. Frustrated. Maybe hurt. Is she going to take our treasure? Our treasure. Lucas had already claimed ownership with the simple, absolute logic of childhood. Daniel crouched to his son's level. It's complicated, buddy. That lady is related to the man who hid the treasure. She thinks it belongs to her family. But we found it, Lucas said with perfect 9-year-old reasoning. And we bought the place where it was hiding. That makes it ours. Daniel wished adult morality were that straightforward. Sometimes what's legal and what's right aren't the same thing. I need to figure out which matters more. That night, Daniel lay awake long after Lucas had fallen asleep, his mind churning through impossible choices. Augustus had written that the land should judge who was worthy. But the land judged nothing. It simply existed, witness to human drama, offering its secrets to whoever happened to be present when they revealed themselves. Daniel hadn't earned this discovery through virtue or dedication. He'd stumbled into it through desperation and his son's curiosity. Did that make him worthy by Augustus's standards? Or did Catherine's 20 years of research and documented struggle qualify her instead? Or maybe, Daniel thought as sleep finally pulled him under, maybe worthiness wasn't something you inherited or earned. Maybe it was something you built, one honest choice at a time. Daniel spent the next 5 days excavating the remaining 2 vaults while Lucas attended the summer program at Brownfield Elementary. Working alone in the brutal Texas heat, Daniel followed Augustus's maps to a location beneath the old loading dock and another behind what had been the rendering building. Each site yielded similar treasures. Gold bars, preserved currency, documents sealed in waterproof containers. By the end of the 5th day, Daniel had inventoried everything. The total was staggering. Between the 4 vaults, he was looking at approximately $580,000 in gold alone. The old currency and stock certificates were harder to value, but a preliminary online assessment suggested another $100,000 if sold to the right collectors. Nearly $700,000. Hidden by a man who died believing his sons would squander anything they inherited through conventional means. Daniel sat in the frozen vault that evening, surrounded by metal cases containing more wealth than he'd ever imagined possessing. Enough to transform Lucas's entire future. College fully funded, a real home instead of sleeping bags on concrete floors, security against every disaster. Everything Jennifer would have wanted for their son. But Augustus's journal lay open on his lap, and the old man's bitter words seemed to judge him across 8 decades. Let the land judge who was worthy. The land had judged nothing. Daniel had simply been desperate enough to buy what no one else wanted, and lucky enough to have a curious son who pressed the right button on the right wall. That wasn't worthiness. That was chance. On the 6th evening, Daniel called Catherine. She answered on the first ring. I want to meet again, he said. Tomorrow if you're available. Same place, 2 o'clock. I'll be there, Catherine said, her voice tight with anticipation. Daniel arrived early, standing in the slaughterhouse parking lot as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Catherine appeared precisely at 2, parking her SUV and approaching with an expression that tried to mask desperation with professional composure. Thank you for calling, she said. Daniel had rehearsed this conversation 100 different ways. Direct honesty still seemed like the only approach that felt right. I found all 4 vaults, he said. The contents match Augustus's descriptions. Everything he said he hid is there. Catherine's breath caught. And? Daniel pulled out his phone, showing her photographs he'd taken of each vault's contents. Your great-grandfather accumulated serious wealth. More than I initially realized. Catherine studied the images, her hand trembling as she scrolled. How much? I estimate close to $700,000 in total value. Maybe more depending on the collectible documents. My God, Catherine whispered. Daniel set his phone down. Augustus wrote that he wanted the land to decide who was worthy. But land doesn't decide anything. People do. So I'm deciding. He paused, making sure he had her full attention. I'm keeping half. Catherine looked up sharply. Half? Half, Daniel confirmed. I purchased this property legally. I found these vaults through my own work and my son's discovery. I need this money to give Lucas a stable life, opportunities he won't have otherwise. That's worth something. And the other half? Catherine asked carefully. Goes to you. Not because you're entitled to it through blood, but because you're the only member of Augustus's family who actually cared about what he built. You've spent 20 years documenting his legacy while everyone else forgot he existed. That's worth something too. Catherine sat very still, processing this. You're serious? We split it down the middle? Completely. You use your half however you want. I'll do the same. No legal fights, no arguments about who deserves more. Just a clean split between two people who both need help and both have reasonable claims. That's extremely generous, Catherine said quietly. It's pragmatic, Daniel corrected. Fighting over this in court would cost both of us money and time neither of us can spare. This way, we both get enough to make real differences in our lives. Catherine studied him for a long moment. You could have kept everything. I have no proof the vaults exist. No legal standing to demand anything. You could have told me you found nothing and I'd have no way to challenge it. I could have, Daniel agreed. But then I'd be exactly the kind of person Augustus was bitter about. Someone taking what they didn't earn, claiming what they don't deserve. I don't want to be that person. And I don't want Lucas growing up thinking that's acceptable. Catherine's eyes filled with unexpected tears. My great-grandfather would have respected you. Maybe, Daniel said. Or maybe he'd be furious I'm sharing with his bloodline at all. But I like to think he'd understand that sometimes the right answer is more complicated than absolute judgment allows. They worked out the logistics over the next 2 weeks. Daniel carefully documented each vault's contents, photographing and inventorying everything. Catherine brought in a discreet appraiser she'd worked with on historical projects, someone who could value the items without asking uncomfortable questions about their origin. The gold bars totaled $592,000 at current market prices. The currency and stock certificates, after authentication, added another $118,000 to the total. $710,000 split evenly. $355,000 each. Daniel opened his first substantial bank account in years, depositing his share in careful increments that wouldn't trigger suspicious activity reports. Catherine did the same, her hands shaking as she completed paperwork that would end years of financial precarity. They met one final time at the slaughterhouse, both of them standing in the frozen vault where Augustus's photograph still hung. Catherine studied her great-grandfather's stern face with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read. I've seen this photograph in copies 100 times, she said. But seeing it in person, in the room he designed to preserve it, that's different. You could take it, Daniel offered. The photograph belongs with family. Catherine shook her head. No, it belongs here. In the vault he built. This is his real legacy, not the money. This secret room, these careful plans, this whole elaborate system he designed to outlast his disappointment. The photograph should stay where he put it. Daniel understood. Some things had value beyond ownership. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the slaughterhouse's main processing floor, watching contractors install new climate control systems throughout the building. The space was being converted into something Augustus probably never imagined but might have appreciated. Mixed-use development. Affordable warehouse space on the ground floor for small businesses and craftspeople. Workshop areas for metalworking, woodworking, leather crafting. Living apartments on the upper floors, including the office Daniel and Lucas still occupied, now properly renovated with real walls and actual furniture. Lucas attended a good school now, driven there each morning in a reliable vehicle Daniel had purchased with cash. The boy had made friends, joined the robotics club, started drawing pictures that included people smiling instead of just mechanical precision. The change in him was remarkable, as if financial stability had lifted a weight he'd been carrying without complaint. Catherine visited occasionally, combining trips to research Augustus's papers with informal friendship that had developed between them. She'd left the community college, using her share of the inheritance to fund a comprehensive book about Augustus Hartman and the immigrant entrepreneurs who'd built Texas's meat-packing industry. A real book with a university press that would cement her academic reputation and hopefully lead to a tenure-track position. You know what I keep thinking about? Catherine said during one visit, standing with Daniel in the renovated ground floor. Augustus spent his whole life building something permanent, and his sons destroyed it in 1 generation. But then you came along, and you're building again. Different vision, different purpose, but the same fundamental drive. Creating something that will outlast you. Daniel looked around at the workshop spaces filling with equipment and supplies. A furniture builder had leased one section. A metalworker another. A woman who made custom saddles and tack occupied a third. All of them were people trying to build small businesses, create something lasting. "I don't think I'm that ambitious," Daniel said. "I just wanted a roof that didn't leak and enough money to give Lucas stability." "That's exactly what Augustus wanted," Catherine said. "Stability for his family, a legacy that would last." "You're more similar than you realize." Maybe she was right. Daniel had never thought of himself as a builder of legacies, just a father trying to survive. But standing here, watching people transform the space Augustus had created into something new yet connected to its past, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose beyond mere survival. That evening, after Catherine had departed and Lucas was working on homework, Daniel returned to the frozen vault one final time. He'd left it largely unchanged despite the renovations, preserving it as a kind of monument to the man whose paranoia had accidentally saved Daniel's life. He looked up at Augustus's photograph, meeting those painted eyes that seemed to assess him across decades. "I hope I did right by you," Daniel said quietly. "I kept half, shared half, tried to build something instead of just taking. Best I could figure." The photograph offered no response, but Daniel hadn't expected one. "The land will judge," Augustus had written. And Daniel understood now what that meant. Buildings rose and fell. Fortunes appeared and vanished. People came and went. But the land remained, witness to all of it, judging none of it, simply existing as the stage where human drama played out. Daniel had stumbled onto this stage by accident, desperate and broke and running out of options. He'd found treasure he hadn't sought and faced moral questions he'd never expected. And in the end, he'd tried to honor both his own needs and a dead man's complicated legacy. Whether that made him worthy by Augustus's standards, Daniel would never know. But standing in that frozen vault, thinking of his sons sleeping peacefully in their renovated home, Daniel thought maybe worthiness wasn't something you earned through grand gestures. Maybe it was something you built slowly, one honest choice at a time. The slaughterhouse hummed around him with new life. Somewhere in the walls, the building's history lived on. All those decades of work and abandonment and rediscovery compressed into concrete and steel. Daniel was just the latest chapter in a story that had begun long before him and would continue long after. But for now, this chapter was his and Lucas's. And in some way, it was also Augustus's. The old man's final plan coming to fruition in ways he could never have predicted. 5 years moved across the slaughterhouse property like seasons, each leaving its mark in ways both visible and profound. The building that had once stood as a monument to abandonment now thrived with purposeful activity 6 days a week. The workshop spaces Daniel had created hosted 14 small businesses now, their combined energy transforming the massive structure into something Augustus Hartman might have recognized despite the changed purpose. Not meat processing anymore, but craft and creation. The fundamental work of building things that would outlast their makers. Lucas turned 14 in the spring of the 5th year, growing tall and confident in ways that sometimes caught Daniel off guard. He'd become something of a local legend. The boy who discovered a frozen vault and changed his family's fortune. The story had spread despite Daniel's attempts at discretion, transformed through adolescent retelling into something more dramatic than reality. Lucas handled the attention with surprising grace, neither denying nor embellishing, simply existing as himself. He developed a passion for engineering, spending hours designing improvements to the slaughterhouse's systems or sketching theoretical machines that could enhance the workshop capabilities. Daniel kept his drawings in a folder in the frozen vault, which remained preserved exactly as they'd found it, Augustus's photograph still watching over the small space with that stern expression. Catherine visited quarterly now, her life transformed by the financial stability Augustus's inheritance had provided. She'd published her book about Texas's meatpacking barons to critical acclaim, parlaying that success into an associate professorship at a university in Austin. But she made time to return to Brownfield, to walk the slaughterhouse property and document its evolution for what she called a companion study about legacy and reinvention. "You've created something remarkable here," she said during her spring visit, surveying the busy workshop floor where a welder was teaching basic metalworking to a group of high school students Daniel had agreed to mentor. This building is more alive now than it was even in Augustus's time. Daniel wasn't sure about that. It's just people working. Same as it always was. No, Catherine corrected gently. It's community. Augustus ran a business. You've built an ecosystem. There's a difference. Maybe there was. Daniel had certainly never planned anything so grand. The workshop spaces had started as a way to generate income to cover the slaughterhouse's maintenance costs, but they'd evolved into something more organic. A place where craftspeople supported each other, shared equipment and expertise, created a network of mutual aid that extended beyond the building's walls into Brownfield's broader community. Carl Morrison from the hardware store had become a regular presence, offering advice to younger craftspeople and occasionally teaching classes on traditional techniques his own grandfather had learned. The circle completing itself in ways no one could have predicted. Daniel had expanded the residential units too, converting more of the second floor into affordable housing for artists and craftspeople who couldn't manage Brownfield's slowly rising rents. Lucas's suggestion actually, born from watching one of the saddle makers struggle with the commute from 3 towns over. 12 units now, all occupied, all contributing to the building's transformation from industrial relic to living community. The money from Augustus's vaults had made all of it possible, but Daniel had been careful not to simply spend the windfall. He'd invested most of it, creating revenue streams that could sustain the slaughterhouse's operations without depleting the principal. His welding background had proven invaluable for the renovation work, allowing him to do much of the labor himself and stretch the budget further than professional contractors could have managed. He still thought about Augustus sometimes, wondered what the old man would make of what his hidden wealth had created. Not the legacy Augustus had probably imagined, but a legacy nonetheless. The Hartman name lived on in the building's informal title. Everyone called it the Hartman Workshops now, even though the property legally belonged to Daniel Reeves. On a warm June evening in that 5th year, Daniel received an unexpected package via courier. Inside, wrapped in protective paper, was an old leather-bound book. The cover was embossed with Augustus Hartman's initials, the pages yellowed but intact. A letter accompanied it, handwritten in shaky script. Mr. Reeves, it began, I am Marcus Hartman, Augustus's great-great-grandson, Catherine's cousin. She told me what you did, how you shared what you could have kept. I wanted you to have this. It's Augustus's personal diary from 1890 to 1900, his first decade in Texas. My father kept it hidden away, never read it, never cared. But Catherine says you understand what Augustus was trying to build. Maybe these words will mean something to you. Daniel opened the diary that evening, reading by lamplight in the frozen vault where Augustus's photograph watched. The entries revealed a younger Augustus, newly arrived in Texas, struggling to establish himself in a brutal industry. He wrote about homesickness, about missing his family in Germany, about the backbreaking work of building something from nothing. But he also wrote about hope. About believing that hard work and honest dealing would create something lasting. About wanting to build a business his children and grandchildren could be proud of. One entry, dated December 1895, stood out. Today I processed my 1,000th head of cattle. A small milestone, but significant to me. I've been thinking about legacy lately, what it means to build something that will outlast you. I don't want my children to simply inherit wealth. I want them to inherit understanding. The knowledge that everything worth having is built slowly, with dedication and integrity. That success means lifting your community, not just yourself. If they learn these lessons, the business will thrive. If they don't, no amount of money will save them. Daniel read those words 3 times, feeling a strange connection across 130 years. Augustus hadn't hidden his wealth out of spite. He'd hidden it as a test, a way to separate those who understood what he'd built from those who only saw dollar signs. The test hadn't worked the way Augustus intended. His sons had failed it by never looking, by selling off the property without caring what might be hidden there. But Daniel had stumbled into it by accident, and in doing so, had created something that honored Augustus's original vision more than the old man could have hoped. The following week, Lucas proposed a project for his 8th grade history class. He wanted to create a documentary about the slaughterhouse's history, interviewing elderly residents who remembered when it operated, preserving their stories before the last generation with direct memories passed away. Daniel helped him set up interviews, provided space in the workshop for filming, watched with quiet pride as his son carefully drew out stories from residents who remembered when the slaughterhouse's whistle had marked the rhythm of Brownfield's workday. Catherine visited specifically to participate in the project, bringing her academic expertise and archival materials to supplement Lucas's interviews. Together, they assembled a collection of photographs, documents, and recorded memories that painted a fuller picture of Augustus Hartman's legacy than any single source could provide. One elderly man, 94 years old, told Lucas during an interview, "My grandfather worked for Augustus Hartman for 30 years. Said he was a hard man, demanding, didn't tolerate laziness. But he was fair. During the Depression, when other operations were closing, Augustus kept the slaughterhouse running, kept men employed. My grandfather said Augustus once told him, a business that doesn't care for its workers isn't a business, it's exploitation. That stuck with my grandfather his whole life." Lucas included that quote in his final presentation, understanding somehow that real legacy existed in complicated spaces. People could be flawed and still worth remembering. Work could be hard and still meaningful. Legacy could survive even when direct descendants failed to preserve it. His history teacher gave him the highest grade in the class and submitted the project to a regional competition, where it won recognition that brought unexpected media attention to the slaughterhouse's revival. A state magazine ran a feature story. A documentary filmmaker from Houston reached out about a potential project. Daniel handled the attention with quiet competence. He gave interviews when necessary, explained the building's evolution without embellishment, deflected questions about the found wealth that had funded the transformation. Some stories were meant to stay private. The 5th anniversary of purchasing the slaughterhouse arrived in August, marked by a celebration the workshop community organized without Daniel's knowledge. They gathered in the main floor space after hours, craftspeople and residents and community members who'd become invested in the building's story. Carl Morrison gave a short speech about Augustus Hartman and the importance of remembering local history. Catherine spoke about legacy and reinvention, how places could hold meaning across generations if people cared enough to preserve and transform them. Lucas, at 14, stood before the assembled group and showed clips from his documentary. His voice steady as he described the connection between past and present, between Augustus's original vision and what his father had created. Daniel watched from the back, simultaneously proud and uncomfortable with attention, relieved when the formal speeches ended and the gathering dissolved into conversation and shared food. Later, after everyone had departed and Lucas had gone to bed, Daniel stood alone in the workshop space, looking at the old photograph of the slaughterhouse in its prime that someone had hung on the wall. The building looked so different in that image. New, purposeful, surrounded by industry and activity that had seemed permanent until it wasn't. Nothing was permanent. Buildings decayed, businesses failed, families scattered. But what persisted was the effort, the attempt to build something meaningful, to leave the world slightly better than you'd found it. Daniel climbed the stairs to the frozen vault, a ritual he'd maintained over the years. The room remained exactly as they'd found it, preserved as a shrine to the complicated old man whose paranoia had accidentally created opportunity. 5 years, Daniel said quietly to Augustus's painted face. Lucas is thriving. The building's alive. We're making it work. He paused. I hope that's enough. I hope it's what you wanted. The photograph offered no response. The conversation was for Daniel's benefit anyway, a way to acknowledge the weight of what he'd been given and what he'd tried to build with it. He turned off the light and closed the vault door, leaving Augustus to watch over the frozen space in darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy or fall short. But tonight, Daniel allowed himself to feel something close to contentment. The slaughterhouse hummed with residual warmth, old concrete holding the day's heat. Lucas slept peacefully in his room, surrounded by engineering books and sketches of machines not yet built. Outside, the Texas night pressed close, vast and star-filled. Daniel paused at his son's doorway, watching him sleep. All the desperate choices, all the unlikely discoveries, all the careful decisions about money and legacy and what constituted doing right, all of it had led to this moment. A sleeping child, safe and secure. A building brought back to life. A community built from abandoned space and hidden wealth. The land will remain, Augustus had written. And Daniel understood now in his bones what that meant. People came and went. Fortunes rose and fell. Buildings stood and crumbled. But the land remained, offering its blank slate to each new generation willing to work and build and try. Daniel Reeves had proven willing. And in Augustus Hartman's hidden legacy, he'd found not just wealth, but purpose. Not just shelter, but home. Not just survival, but the possibility of something that might actually last. 10 years slipped past the slaughterhouse like water through Texas clay, soaking in slowly, changing everything from the inside out. The building that Daniel Reeves had purchased for $310 out of desperation had become something no one could have predicted. Not a museum preserving the past, but a living organism that honored history while creating its own. Lucas turned 19 in the summer of the 10th year, no longer the frightened 9-year-old who'd discovered a hidden vault but a young man who carried himself with quiet confidence earned through stability and purpose. He'd graduated high school with honors, accepted a full scholarship to Texas A&M for mechanical engineering, but deferred enrollment for a year. Not because he couldn't handle college, but because he wanted time to build something first. "I've been thinking about the rendering building," Lucas said one evening, spreading sketches across the dinner table in their apartment. The apartment that had started as a bare office with sleeping bags on the floor now held real furniture, photographs on the walls, a kitchen where Daniel cooked actual meals. "It's the only structure we haven't renovated. I want to convert it into a technical school. Small scale, maybe 20 students at a time. Focus on trades. Welding, metalwork, carpentry, electrical. Skills people can actually use." Daniel studied his son's detailed plans, recognizing the careful precision that had always defined Lucas's approach to the world. "That's ambitious. Also expensive." "I know," Lucas said. "But we've got the capital. And more importantly, we've got the expertise. Every craftsperson in the workshops could teach. Carl Morrison's already said he'd volunteer. It wouldn't just be a school. It would be passing on what people here actually know." It was exactly the kind of project Augustus Hartman would have approved of. Not just creating wealth, but creating capability. Teaching people to build things that would outlast them. "Let's do it," Daniel said. They broke ground on the technical school in September, and the workshop community rallied around the project in ways that still surprised Daniel even after a decade. Craftspeople donated time and materials. Local businesses contributed equipment. The woman who made custom saddles designed a leatherworking curriculum. The furniture builder created a woodworking program. The metalworker, a gruff man named Pete who'd been one of the first to lease workshop space, took personal responsibility for the welding instruction. Catherine visited during the construction phase, documenting the expansion for her second book. She'd become a full professor now, her work on Augustus Hartman having established her as a leading voice in Southwestern industrial history. But she still made time for Brownfield, still walked the slaughterhouse property like someone visiting sacred ground. "You're doing it again," she said, watching Lucas direct a team of volunteers installing electrical systems in the rendering building. "Doing what?" Daniel asked. "Building something that will outlast you. Just like Augustus did." Daniel had stopped trying to compare himself to Augustus Hartman. The old man had been a visionary, however flawed. Daniel was just someone who'd been desperate enough to see possibility in abandonment, and honest enough to share what he'd found. But watching Lucas work, seeing the technical school take shape, Daniel understood what Catherine meant. Legacy wasn't about blood or inheritance. It was about understanding what mattered and having the courage to build it, knowing you might never see the full result. The Hartman Technical Institute, as they named it, opened in January with 16 students. Kids from Brownfield and surrounding towns who couldn't afford college or didn't want to, who needed practical skills that would let them work with their hands and build actual things. The tuition was minimal, subsidized by the workshop community and what remained of Daniel's share of Augustus's gold. Lucas taught the mechanical systems course himself, despite being only 19. He had a gift for explaining complex concepts in ways that made sense, a patience with struggling students that reminded Daniel achingly of Jennifer. She would have been proud of what their son had become. On a mild February evening, Daniel stood alone in the frozen vault where Augustus's photograph still hung. He did this sometimes, especially when big decisions loomed or gratitude needed expressing to someone who couldn't hear it. The vault remained exactly as they'd found it 10 years earlier, preserved as the building's beating heart. The place where everything had changed. "Your great-great-grandson sent me your early diary," Daniel said to the stern-painted face. "I read about your first years here. The struggle, the doubt. You wrote that you wanted to build something your children could be proud of. You wanted them to inherit understanding, not just wealth." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "They didn't get it. But somehow, we did. My son's teaching welding the kids who need a path forward. Your great-granddaughter's preserving your story for people who'll never meet you. And this building you created, it's alive again. Not the way you imagined, but maybe better. Maybe exactly what you hoped for when you wrote about lifting communities instead of just yourself." The photograph offered no response, but Daniel hadn't expected one. These conversations were for him, a ritual that kept him grounded, reminded him how unlikely this all was. How easily it could have been different. In March, Carl Morrison died peacefully in his sleep at 92. The funeral filled Brownfield's small Methodist church, a testament to a life lived with integrity in a community that remembered such things. Daniel and Lucas attended, along with most of the workshop community. During the service, person after person stood to tell stories about Carl's generosity, his willingness to teach, his quiet investments in other people's success. At the reception afterward, Carl's daughter approached Daniel. "Dad wanted you to have this," she said, handing him a worn leather tool belt. It was his grandfather's. The grandfather who worked for Augustus Hartman. "Dad said you'd understand why it matters." Daniel held the ancient tool belt, feeling the weight of 3 generations of honest work. "I do. Thank you." That night, he hung the tool belt in the frozen vault, next to Augustus's photograph. A memorial to the workers who'd built the original slaughterhouse, who'd trusted Augustus Hartman to pay fairly and treat them with dignity. The people whose labor had created the wealth that now funded technical education for their great-great-grandchildren. The circle completing itself in ways no one could have predicted. Spring brought unexpected visitors. A documentary crew from PBS, following up on the magazine articles about the slaughterhouse's transformation. They spent a week filming, interviewing craftspeople and technical students, capturing the daily rhythm of a place that had somehow become more than the sum of its parts. The producer, a woman named Sarah with sharp eyes and sharper questions, asked Daniel during his interview, "What do you think Augustus Hartman would say if he could see this place now?" Daniel had thought about this question for 10 years. "I think he'd be surprised. Maybe disappointed that it's not the meat-packing operation he built. But I hope he'd recognize that we're trying to do what he did. Create something that serves people, that teaches skills, that builds community. Just in a different form." "Do you ever feel like you're living in his shadow?" Sarah asked. "No," Daniel said honestly. "I feel like we're living in his light. There's a difference." The documentary aired in July, and suddenly the Hartman workshops received national attention. Inquiries came from other Rust Belt communities wanting to know how to revitalize abandoned industrial buildings. Foundations reached out offering grants for the technical school. A philanthropist in Dallas donated $50,000 specifically for scholarships. Daniel handled the attention with the same quiet competence he'd applied to everything else, accepting help that served the community while deflecting personal recognition. This wasn't about him. It was about what could happen when you honored the past while building toward the future. In August, on the 10th anniversary of purchasing the Slaughterhouse, the workshop community organized a celebration. Not just for Daniel, but for everyone who'd contributed to the building's resurrection. They gathered at sunset in the main floor space, craftspeople and students and residents and community members who'd watched something impossible become real. Lucas gave a short speech, his voice steady as he talked about what the place had meant to him growing up. When we moved here, I was scared. Everything in my life felt broken. But my dad taught me that broken things could be fixed if you cared enough to do the work. This building was broken. Our lives were broken. And somehow, through fixing one, we fixed the other. Catherine spoke about Augustus Hartman, about the complicated legacy of a man who'd built an empire and lost it through his children's failures, only to have it reborn through strangers who understood what he'd been trying to create. Pete, the metalworker who now taught welding at the technical school, talked about what it meant to have a place that valued skill and craftsmanship in a world that increasingly didn't. Daniel didn't speak. He stood at the back, watching faces illuminated by the setting sun through the high windows, listening to stories about how the workshops had changed lives. A single mother who'd learned woodworking and now supported her family making custom furniture. A veteran who'd found purpose teaching leatherwork after struggling with civilian life. A kid from the first technical school class who'd been hired by a major construction company and sent money back to fund scholarships for future students. These were the real measures of success. Not the gold bars or the money in the bank, but the lives touched, the skills passed on, the community built from abandonment and desperation and one man's hidden wealth. As the sun set completely and someone lit strings of lights across the ceiling, Daniel slipped away to the frozen vault one last time. He stood before Augustus's photograph in the dim space, the old man's stern face flickering in the light from his phone. "We made it 10 years, Daniel said quietly. "Lucas is grown, confident, building his own legacy. The Slaughterhouse is thriving. We're teaching kids the skills they need to build lives. I kept half your gold and shared half with Catherine. She used it to tell your story properly. I used it to create what you originally wanted, a place that serves people and builds community." He paused, feeling the weight of a decade compressed into this moment. "I don't know if that makes me worthy by your standards. But it's the best I could do with what you left behind." For the first time in 10 years, Daniel felt like the conversation was complete. He'd spent a decade trying to prove himself to a dead man's judgment, trying to honor intentions written in bitter disappointment 80 years ago. But standing here now, he realized Augustus's approval didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that Daniel had made choices he could live with, built something his son could be proud of, honored the past while creating a future. That was enough. He turned to leave the vault, then paused, looking back at the photograph one final time. "Thank you," he said simply. "For hiding what you hid, for writing what you wrote, for caring enough about the future to create this whole elaborate test. We passed. Not the way you expected, but we passed." Outside, the celebration continued. Lucas was laughing with technical school students, explaining something about engine mechanics with animated gestures. Catherine was deep in conversation with Pete about oral history preservation. The workshop spaces glowed with warm light, filled with people who'd found purpose and community in a building that had been dead for 19 years before Daniel bought it for $310. Daniel stood in the doorway between the frozen vault and the living space, between past and present, between what had been lost and what had been found. The Slaughterhouse hummed around him with life and purpose, every corner holding stories of transformation and second chances. "The land will remain," Augustus had written. And he'd been right. The building stood on Texas clay that had witnessed 130 years of human drama. Births and deaths, success and failure, hope and disappointment. The land remembered all of it, held all of it, offered its blank slate to each new generation willing to work. Daniel had been willing. Desperate, yes, but also willing. And in that willingness, he'd found not just survival, but meaning. Not just shelter, but home. Not just an inheritance, but a legacy he could shape with his own hands. He thought about Jennifer sometimes, wondered what she'd think of where they'd ended up. The struggling welder she'd married had become something else. Not rich, despite the gold. Not famous, despite the documentary. Just someone who'd stumbled into responsibility and chosen to honor it. A father who'd given their son stability and purpose. A steward of a building that had become more than property. Maybe that would have been enough for her. It was enough for Daniel. The Texas night settled over Brownfield, vast and star-filled. Inside the Hartman workshops, people continued celebrating a decade of transformation. Outside, the land held its eternal witness, patient and enduring as it had always been. And in a frozen vault at the building's heart, Augustus Hartman's photograph watched over the space he designed to hide his wealth, the wealth that had accidentally saved Daniel Reeves and given purpose to everyone who'd found their way to this unlikely place. The building had been dead. Now it lived. The legacy had been lost. Now it continued. The land had witnessed failure. Now it witnessed resurrection. And somewhere in the spaces between those truths, in the quiet transformation of abandonment into purpose, Augustus Hartman's complicated dream finally found the inheritors it had been waiting for. Not his blood, but his spirit. Not his sons, but someone who understood that legacy isn't inherited, it's earned through choices made when no one's watching and the only judge is your own conscience. Daniel closed the vault door and rejoined the celebration, carrying with him the weight of 10 years, the lessons of a bitter old man, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes desperate chances lead to purposes worth building. The slaughterhouse stood against the Texas night, no longer a monument to industrial death, but a testament to what happens when people care enough to honor the past while building toward the future. The Hartman name lived on, not through blood inheritance, but through the community that had grown in the shadow of Augustus's hidden wealth. And that, Daniel thought as he watched his son laugh with friends in the space they'd built together, was exactly the kind of legacy that would remain long after the last gold bar was spent and the last story was told. The land remembered everything. And now it had something worth remembering. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.